Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter. In this episode of Dig It, we speak to Val Bourne, a lifelong gardener and award-winning garden writer whose name will be familiar to readers of The Telegraph, Country Life, Gardens Illustrated, Amateur Gardening and Saga magazine, amongst others. As well as writing and lecturing, Val is an organic hands-on gardener and by her own admission, a committed plantaholic. Val, a very warm welcome to Dig It. And as I mentioned to Peter before preparing this chat, when I was editing Garden Ideas magazine, you were my very first regular columnist in the gardening magazine, covering multi-layers of wildlife gardening. So it's really nice to have a proper chat.
Well, that was quite a long time ago, Chris.
I know. It's 24 years ago, scarily. I was looking, that's a long time. But So perhaps can we just sort of paint a picture? Where did your wonderful affair and hook to the wonderful world of plants and nature begin? Is there a starting point?
Well, it began for all the wrong reasons, really, because I'm a twin. And I have this habit of waking up very early, and I was very talkative, and I still do chat a lot. And I used to wake up when I was a small child, and we lived with my grandmother. My mother and father both worked, which was very unusual because I grew up in the 1950s in suburban London. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother would take me out of the cot, and she'd take me in the garden, because otherwise I'd wake everybody else up. And I'm a twin, and I shared a room with my brother. And so she'd whip me out as soon as she heard me make any noise. At about 5 o'clock on a summer's morning, I was whipped out of the cot and straight into the garden. And she was the most interesting person because she was born in 1881. Mm-hmm. And she was a bit like Queenie in Lark Rise to Candlefoot, in that there was a story about every plant. So she told me when I was quite small about alchemilla being named after alchemists. And alchemists were sort of people who turned ordinary metal into gold. So she sort of extended the plants, but she also gave me lots of little jobs to do. And I was very small, probably only about 3 when I started trying to pick caterpillars off cabbages and things like that. And that's really why I'm an organic gardener and why I've always been a gardener, because I grew up with it.
Yeah. So I mean, thinking about, they're amazing to have those sort of memories from, such an early age. That's quite amazing. So can you, sort of take your mind back to your very earliest recollections of your garden at that time, or your parents' garden?
Well, it was quite an ordinary garden. It was the Dig for Victory era. We had a neighbour next door. It was quite peculiar because it was a row of 5 houses, and they were terraced. And there were 3 sets of twins within the 5 houses. And there used to be lots of jokes about milkmen, if I recall. And Mrs. Dickinson next door had chickens, which a lot of people kept, because I was born in 1950. I'm incredibly ancient. And it was very much a sort of, the air raid shelters were still in place and people were growing vegetables. But my very, very earliest memory is actually watching a bee on an Aquilegia. And I watched the tongue unfurling. It must have been a long-tailed bee because the nectar in Aquilegias is in those long spurs. Mm-hmm. And you see, my grandmother told me when I was very, very small that Aquilegia was named after Aquila for eagle because she'd been a very keen gardener. So, it's sort of insects and plants have always been connected, and that is one of my very earliest memories. And the other one is being given a bucket of salt water, and it was a tin bucket, and you had to put the caterpillars in. And I didn't put them in. I put them in my hand and carried them up at the back alley and put them outside someone else's garden because I didn't want to put them in the salty water. Excellent. So those are my 2 earliest memories.
Well, thank you for sharing those. But equally, I knew about putting slugs and salt together and not being very nice for slugs, but I've never thought of caterpillars and salt. So that's a nice little organic method.
Put them in water and horrible thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just thinking back now, Val, when I first met you, you were living in the beautiful village of Hook Norton, literally just down the road from the girls.
The village is dear, and I wish I was still living there. I can tell you that.
It's a wonderful brewery. I had the pleasure of going around it last year when I was going camping down that way. We stopped in to get some supplies for our camping.
Like you do.
Yeah, it's a wonderful building, isn't it? I didn't see the village.
It's a lovely, friendly, big village, and people don't move out. So I've been left for 18 years now, and I go back and I still see the same people. But the reason I say I'd rather like to be there is because that garden was in the middle of Hook Norton, and it was free draining. And Hook Norton's actually in the rain shadow, so we never got too much rain there. Okay. And now I'm stuck in a village called Cold Aston, high in the Cotswolds, which seems to get the worst of the weather all the time.
So you get all the rain that might have fallen on Hook Norton, but it gets to you first.
I'd quite like to go back, but
so I was going to say, Val, obviously when I was at the magazine, we obviously had some lovely photographs of your garden, which we used in in your articles. But what's your fondest memories then of? It was Homefield. Was that the name of your property?
Yes, it was Homefield. I mean, I love the garden, but I've been there for 18 years, and I was living with Joe at the time, who's now my husband, and we just wanted to get a house together that we both owned. That was basically it. Yes. But I do wish in many ways I hadn't moved, because that was such a lovely setting, that garden.
No,
Can you give us a sort of description of what style of garden it was for our listeners who possibly don't know?
Because it was free draining, it was on ironstone.
Yep.
I mean, it didn't get masses of rain. The ironstone used to absorb the heat from the ground, and it used to radiate the heat upwards. So it was a very warm, sheltered garden, because Hook Norton itself is in a sort of almost like a bowl between the hills.
Okay.
And it was actually very famous for cherry growing in times past, because it was such it had so much heat radiating up from the ground. It was very good for cherry growing. So I could grow all sorts of manner of things in the garden. Silvery foxgloves like digitalis haywoodii, all sorts of silverleaf plants. I grew a lot of Dieramas, all Agapanthus. There were lots of things I grew there that I can't grow here. And it was a very soft, feminine garden.
That sounds right. The photographs were always amazing, and I believe it was this particular garden then which inspired you to write a book about your experiences.
Well, what actually inspired me, funnily enough, was a radio program called Dig It.
Oh.
That's an amazing coincidence, isn't it?
Oh, that is a coincidence.
But I used to do, when I first started writing in 95, I landed a spot on this radio program for Thames Valley called Dig It.
Okay.
And I was about 45 at the time, and I'd had all these years of organic gardening, because I'd worked in vegetable research where we used a lot of chemicals. So I made up my mind I wasn't going to ever put anything on my garden at all. So I went off to do this radio program, and I'd always grown fruit and vegetables, and I've still got an allotment here. We've both got an allotment. Joe and I have got allotments. And I went to this radio program, and it was the sort of thing where people phone you up.
Okay.
And they say, I've got black spot on my roses, I've got sooty mold on my laburnum, and you give them an answer. But of course, I was on with another chap. There were three of us actually, three other people doing it. So it was like a rota. And I got the second dibs of the questions, probably because I was new, but perhaps because I was a woman. And they would say the same thing every week. They would say, buy a fungicide, go down and buy this, spray with this. It was all chemically related. And then I would give the organic answer. So the black spot on roses, I would say, well, perhaps it's a bad variety. Perhaps the rose needs feeding. It was and I came out of that program every week feeling totally out of kilter with the rest of the gardening world, because I hadn't ever gone down that route. And to cut a long story short, after about 6 weeks, they asked me to go. Because
Gosh.
nobody, his actual words were, "You have a wonderful radio voice, but nobody wants organic answers."
Gosh.
Wow.
Oh,
And
different
it was
times.
95, and I thought, well, I'm going to write a book about my garden, because I've been gardening at home for them. I moved there in 88, so I've been there about 13 years, and I wasn't having any of the problems that people reported. And I thought, I'm going to write a book about my garden. And I had a huge problem with that book, because I had no idea, not any idea at all, why the garden was trouble-free. I just didn't know why I didn't get black spot on my roses. I couldn't grow many roses at Hook Norton's. That's not a great thing. But I was growing things that grew well in those conditions. So I started trying to think about how to write this book. So I spent probably 4 or 5 years just looking at the garden and trying to weigh up why I didn't have loads of aphids. So that was basically it.
Because in your book, there's a lovely story about aphids.
Is that the Living Jigsaw one, or the...
Yeah.
I was
Jigsaw.
sorry.
Well,
No.
I was actually talking about The Natural Gardener, which I wrote about the garden in Hook Norton. But when I came to write The Living Jigsaw, we'd moved here, and it was completely empty, the garden. But the shed was full of all sorts of chemicals, like DDT,
Oh, gosh.
and all sorts of benlate and goodness only knows what. It'd been very heavily chemically treated. So it was a chance to sort of start again. And I studied the garden in Hook Norton, and I realised what I needed to do, basically, which was to have great diversity and to build up insect life. And that's why I wrote The Living Jigsaw. So if we'd moved here, I probably would never have written it.
Interesting, yes.
Yeah, because there's a lovely story about ants and honeydew. I read that story. I was like, I never knew ants protected little aphids and things.
I went on a journey when I came out of that radio program, and I went straight to ladybirds because I could actually recognise them. And I started looking at ladybirds, and they lived in different parts of the garden, different species, and that led me to believe that having lots of plants is a really good thing. But then I came out one day, and 2 ladybirds were mating, and it was when I was in Hook Norton, so it would have been probably the late 90s. And at that time, I had a film camera, a Pentax.
Okay.
And they looked so wonderful that it was April, and they were on the leaves of Gibson Scarlet. And I thought, I've got to take that picture. So I got my tripod out, and it was in the days of Velvia film, which was quite expensive. And I had 4 rolls of it. And I set up the tripod, and every time I pressed it, it made a noise, and the ladybirds started moving. Now, if I tell you that I took 4 rolls of film, which I think is 144 pictures, and only 4 of them were in focus.
Oh, no. Oh, gosh.
You can see that was a very expensive photo.
Labour of love.
And then I started, and that led me to look for ladybird eggs. So when I first started, in the 1990s, looking for all these things, I didn't really know that much about the natural world. But there are some really good books, that would help people. Jennifer Owen, who studied a garden in Leicestershire for 30 years by trapping insects. She did a book with the RHS called Wildlife in the Garden, I think it is. She did that book, and it's a really interesting book. There are lots of she was probably the pioneer because she didn't use any chemicals, and she was in suburban Leicestershire, and she found all this insect life, and that was just what happened to me when I started actually looking for things like ladybird eggs, ladybird larvae. I really started getting my eye in and just going out there and watching butterflies and really enjoying all the movement. And in the mid-1990s, there was lots of insect life, and sadly there isn't now. So it was a bit of an eye-opener, really.
Yeah.
I can remember the first time I saw a ladybird pupa crawling around on my run of beans, and I was like, is that a caterpillar? And took a photo of it, and with my digital camera, so I didn't have any film to waste. And took it in to show my mother, and she's like, yeah, it's just a ladybird pupa. But until you've seen one, you think, oh, is it a caterpillar? It is amazing wildlife like that, isn't it?
Do you think with ladybirds, though, it is a bit of a beauty and the beast, isn't it? Because the larva is quite... well, it doesn't look particularly friendly, shall we say. Yeah. That's good. Val, can we just sort of rewind a little bit to 2005? That's when you moved into your new garden at Spring Cottage, where you're now.
Well, I think I think garden is a bit of an exaggeration. It was a sort of muddy patch, really.
Okay.
There was nothing in the garden at all.
Really? Oh.
Apart from one cottage garden peony, some alchemilla, and there was a white beam in the corner of the garden, which is still there. And there was nothing else at all.
Okay.
Apart from a lot of old daffodils. But when we moved in at this time of year, actually, almost, at the beginning of December, it actually was. So, there was nothing up. We didn't know about the old daffodils until the spring. But, it was completely bare. There was nothing in here at all, because the man who'd had it previously had sort of run it as an allotment and grown vegetables before he became too ill to do it.
And was it really, obviously you indicated earlier on, it wasn't particularly plain sailing to grow the plants you want to grow, but how's it moved on in those, nearly sort of 20 years?
Well, it wasn't really plain sailing, because I imagined, having moved 19 miles further west and a sort of similar latitude, that this garden was going to be very similar to the one at Hook Norton, and I was in for a terrible shock. We're on the spring line. We've got very deep soil, but it doesn't hold nutrients very well. There's no clay content.
Okay.
So it's quite free draining, which is good news. But the thing about Cold Aston, which is a village, fairly near Stow-on-the-Wold, where the wind blows cold, I think Cold Aston is even colder than Stow. So we wrestle with the weather here. We get the full extent of the wind because we face south and we overlook fields for about 4 or 5, well, certainly 2 or 3 miles. So the wind comes rushing across. And it's not as easy to grow things here as it was in Hook Norton. I can't grow zinnias here. There's lots of things I can't grow here that I grew in Hook Norton because it's just too chilly. Okay. So I think it was a very much an experimental. And the very first thing I did is I came, having put it in my contract, by the way, when I left Hook Norton, I arranged to bring my hellebores and snowdrops because I'd spent many years collecting hellebores and I didn't want to just leave them there. So I dug them up and I put them down the bottom end of the garden. And, they flowered in the following spring really, really well. You can move hellebores and they won't blink.
Gosh.
If you move them at the back end of autumn, that sort of time, they will just transfer. But when they flowered, they looked awful because there was nothing to give them any scale. There were no trees or anything. They were just like a sort of gaudy carpet of very colourful bedding. And that was the first time in my 55 years I realised how important trees and shrubs were, not only for draining the soil and protecting the plants, but just giving them that scale. And I remember I planted my first tree, which was a flowering cherry, and it was a small parasol. And I put it in, and immediately it gave these ground-hugging woodlanders, context. So I've spent a long time planting shade here because we face south. I've got 14 witch hazels in the woodland patch. I've got a lot of Daphne Bholuas. I've got winter sweet. I've got winter honeysuckle. And the whole idea was to create this shade and cut down the effects of the wind so that I could grow my passionate things I'm passionate about. It's too wet down there for snowdrops, but I've got trilliums and hardy ferns down there. And I needed to create all that sort of shelter belt in that southeasterly corner before I could even think about putting them down there.
I think, Val, you're giving some really good advice there. That's most important, isn't it? We always say with people going to new builds, especially put in the long-term plants, put the hedges and the trees and the shrubs. But sometimes, which comes first, the cart or the horse, isn't it? It's one of those sort of situations.
Well, you have to I had to put that structure in around the things I'd already planted in that bed. And actually, the hellebores don't do that well down there because it's a sloping garden and it slopes down to the spring, and it lays a little wet down there. Mm-hmm. We don't grow hellebores here anything like as well as we did in Hook Norton, and I think it's probably climate change as well because we're getting hotter, drier summers, which they don't like. But I spent a long time putting in. There are 3 apple trees, and they were sticks when I put them in. And, now they feed us, keep us in apples in good years right the way through. So I spent a lot of time putting in plants, the 2 pear trees, which don't do well here, and various shrubs like Philadelphus. I grow a lot of roses. So I spent a lot of time shoveling plants in, really.
And where did you get where do you draw your inspiration from for the layout of the garden? Obviously, as you've explained, different plots have different benefits and sort of weaknesses and things.
Well, the plants tell me where to go, really, because we face south, so the area close to the house gets quite hot and dry.
Okay.
And it's good deep soil. Part of it is spring fed. We get quite a lot of rain. So I always wanted to grow Lactiflora peonies and roses, but I couldn't grow them at Hook Norton because the soil was wrong. So when we came here, I started to put roses in there because I noticed that they were growing well in other parts of the village. And when you move to an area, that's a really good thing to do. Go and have a nose over the garden gates, see what you see, and you'll spot things again and again in the same gardens, that are growing well. So I realized that roses will grow well here. And so I started to make rose and peony borders there. And that's really all summer. Those are summer borders. So it starts with peonies, goes on to roses, goes on to phloxes, border phloxes, and then that's extended until about September. By things like cosmos and penstemons and things like that. The lower part of the garden is the woodland garden with all the woodlanders and the shrubs, spring flowering shrubs in. And then I've got an autumn border on the sort of southwesterly edge. So by segregating gardens like that into different seasonal areas, it looks much better. You don't end up with a peony fading in August next to an aster, which is in full flow. But it makes garden maintenance easier as well because you can go in and work on a whole area and either cut it down or weed it or get on top of it all at the same time.
Val, when I was reading your book, The Living Jigsaw, and you do feature an awful lot of roses in the book, so I gather, I assume they are a bit of a passion of yours.
Well, they are a passion of mine, but also I'm a crusader when it comes to using chemicals. And I wanted to prove to people that as an organic gardener, you can grow roses and you don't need to worry about black spot if you choose your roses wisely. And I was very fortunate when I came here that I was given by the British Rose Association, BARB, I was given the Rose of the Year in 2006, which was Champagne Moment, raised by Cordes, the German rose breeders, which is a floribunda. Well, I didn't set out to grow that rose, but when you've got an empty garden, you're looking for plants all the time. And if somebody says, would you like a free rose? You say yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's a tremendous rose. And when I looked into why it's a tremendous rose and realized that Cordes had stopped in their rose fields probably 20 or 30 years ago in order to breed healthy roses, it set me on a path to find others. And some of the roses I grow never get black spot. And I grow wild Eve, which is a Dale Austin rose, which is absolutely brilliant. Lots and lots of flower. It's pink. It's not too big. Quite a wide rose. So I have to use like a big semicircular stake around it to hold the branches together, because we're windy here. But that with the champagne moment is absolutely superb. And so I've gone on adding roses, and I'm quite ruthless. If they get black spot for 2 years running, I'm afraid I'd dig them up because I can't spray. So I don't use any slug bait, any insecticides. I use nothing in my garden at all. And being a plantaholic, I'm always acquiring plants. I never go past Buckingham Garden Centre without calling in.
That's good.
I always have a rummage, and I come out with a plant. Yeah. So I'm acquiring plants wherever I go. And that means that my planting style is very dense. And I used to do that because I love plants and I was always shoving them in. But actually it works very well in an organic garden because you're creating that leafy canopy and it's no space, no soil is exposed after about April, May, June, that sort of time. So you're locking the carbon in and you're also encouraging all these things at soil level, particularly ground beetles. And ground beetles are very good predators of slugs. And I think that's one of the reasons I don't have trouble with slugs.
Yeah, it's all about sort of balance, isn't it? You're doing these things.
Yeah.
I would say, Val, on the you do have a wonderful understanding of all aspects of wildlife in your book, the Living Jigsaw, and also in your fortnightly column in Amateur Gardening magazine. How do you glean all this information? Are you self-taught? I mean, you made a reference to the book earlier on, but do you do the necessary research or? Well,
the thing is, I did. And when I started looking at insects, I would buy books. So I bought a book on beetles and I'd buy a book on hoverflies. But entomologists, all they seem interested in doing is splitting things into species and identifying them. You ask an entomologist, or if you asked an entomologist 20 or 30 years ago, what does an earwig do? They couldn't actually tell you.
But they could tell you how many legs it's got.
It's first-hand observation. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was at Hook Norton, I spent no end of time on my hands and knees looking at my plants, looking for ladybird larvae and pupae and things like that. And I discovered that all the ladybirds seem to like to pupate on silver-leafed foliage. So if I went to a sage or a bolota or some other silvery leaf plant, an Artemisia, I would find ladybird larvae. And the strange thing is, I also found them on the aluminium struts of my greenhouse. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. So I went round and I said to Andrew Holstead, who's a lovely chap, and he was the RHS entomologist at the time, I believe that ladybirds like to pupate on silver foliage. And he said, no, that's not true. And I said, why isn't it true? He said, because you can actually see them better on silver foliage. If you keep looking, you'll find just as many on green leaves. So because I'm a bit of a nerd, I spent another couple of years crawling around my garden looking at green foliage. And I can tell you that ladybirds do like to pupate on silver foliage. You get far more on silver foliage. So a lot of the knowledge I've accrued, obviously not all of it, because I do look things up and I find things out. And there are wonderful websites now, like the British Trust for Ornithology and Bug Life and all those sites. I do use them, but a lot of the things start off actually in my garden with me looking at things and wondering about them and watching them.
And can I ask?
That's just me.
Can I just ask? Have you noticed? Obviously, when you first moved into the house you're in at the moment, you're saying that it was a bit barren and not very plant friendly, shall we say? You've obviously planted it all up now, and you've treated it to a life of organic sort of gardening. Have you noticed that the higher order predators, as in the bird, the bigger part of wildlife has moved into the garden as well as all the tiny little bugs and beetles and things?
It is a slightly difficult question to answer because we definitely get more bird life. We stopped feeding our birds in the winter, which sounds cruel, but we were finding that we were getting a lot of blue tits, and nesting sites are in very short supply, and the blue tits were taking a lot of nesting sites from other birds. So we have got much more insect life and bird life, and we sort of tweak it as we go. So when we first were here, we got black fly on the runner beans and nothing ate them because there was nothing in this garden. But as we've brought more shrubs and trees and planting in, we've definitely got more insect life. But there are far fewer insects than there were in the 1990s. When I was teaching in the first years of the 1990s, I had to drive towards Stratford-upon-Avon, which is about 20 miles away from Hookey. And twice a week, I'd have to leave early, get up early, and spend time cleaning my windscreen because I had so many insects on it. Well, you don't get that now. And I've got a video that was taken in the garden in 1996, and it's full of flecks of movement behind me. The person is actually photographing the garden, but you can't miss all the little insects buzzing about in the background because sunlight is catching the movement of them. And that's really, really declined. And since we've been here, we've lost a lot of species. So we used to have missel thrushes in the holly tree at the back where they've gone. We used to have barn owls down in the copse, which is a field away. But then new people moved in and they started clearing it, so they went. We used to have spotted flycatchers in the summer. They went 2 years ago. So we're sort of, we're missing species that we used to get in the garden. So we, on one level it works, and on another level it's going down. And people are still indoctrinated into thinking that they need to use pesticides and herbicides, and they certainly don't understand what pesticides do. Have I got time to tell you what pesticides do or not?
Well, please do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you use a pesticide, you spray it on, and it might be systemic, it might be surface, and it's designed to kill aphids. That's why people panic. They think, oh my God, I've got aphids. And they think for some reason they're locusts. And they're not. They're very species specific. They don't rampage through the whole garden, and they can easily be wiped off by the fingers because they've got feeding tubes. But they think they've got to use this insecticide, so they use it. And what they actually do is they kill every soft-bodied creature in their garden, and that includes ladybird larvae, hoverfly, all the things that are on the plant, will succumb. A lot of them will go. And the thing about aphids is they reproduce so quickly that they can produce 40 generations per year. And in the Living Jigsaw book, I write about René Remer, a French mathematician, calculating if one aphid was allowed to breed, it could do a military formation 4 times deep right on the equator, which is quite something. I don't know whether it's right, but you get the message. They have their babies inside them. Yep. So they don't have to find a mate like the rest of us do. They have their babies inside them, and they produce clones of themselves. So if that aphid has some resistance to pesticides, it passes that resistance straight down into its offspring, and all those offspring are the same. And Rothamsted Research Station proved that this is speeding up evolution. So insects are becoming very, very resistant to pesticides and the same pesticide. My daughter was talking about her dog fleas the other day because the stuff she puts on the dog's neck isn't working anymore. But it's because they've developed resistance. And actually, you're far better not to kill across the board, not to use a garlic spray, not to use soft soap, because all the other creatures, like the ladybirds, they only produce 1 or 2 generations a year. So they take a lot longer to recover. And actually, by spraying with an insecticide, you're not only building up that resistance, you're actually giving them free rein, because there are no predators around really to eat them. You've killed so many other things as well. And when I was at Wellesbourne, that's actually how we raised 4 aphids for our experiments. One blitz with a superficial insecticide, which just killed everything, and then the aphids bounced back. So, it's really doing a lot of damage. Using insecticides is doing a lot of ecological damage in gardens, because when you get all those lower orders, they're underpinning everything else. So you get an aphid and perhaps 6 or 7 things above them in the sort of food web, they're above them in the food chain, will be eating those aphids. So to pull that away creates a lot of problems. But gardeners are still, under the impression that they've got to treat aphids, that they have to spray for black spot, even though they could go buy a perfectly healthy rose that wouldn't suffer from it. And my cause in life is to try to change people's attitudes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you for that. Now, can I ask you a question about ladybirds? Obviously, you've clearly observed quite a few of them in your time. Do you know sort of what are the ones with different numbers of spots feeding on different creatures, or do they all like to predate on whatever they can?
Well, the strange thing is that they live in different places and they hibernate in different places. And one of the ladybirds that was really common when I was a child, which was always on rose bushes, was the 2-spot. And that's not very common at all now. And 7 spots are still living fairly well. But there are meadow species as well. There are mildew eaters, and they all inhabit different niches, really.
Okay.
So, that's why diversity is so important, to provide these different plants, because you'll get 7 spots prefer to roost on the ground, and you often find them in leaf litter or tucked in among ferns. So it's quite sort of important. So every creature, and it's the same with bees. Bees have different length tongues, and they emerge at different times, bumblebees. So it's very important to have, different types of flowers. A lot of bumblebees have short tongues, the earlier flowering ones, so they need things like crocuses and hellebores. And they need them, they really do need them, because they come out of hibernation. They've got no food stores down there at all. They have to find a new nest. They have to start to produce, to make their colonies. And, they do really need nectar and pollen. So, but later on in the year, you get longer-tongued bumblebees who can access things like snapdragons and nepetas. So having this mix of flowers throughout the year, lots of different shapes, it's because they've all got their different preferences. I mean, they're just like us in a way. I mean, if you said to somebody, let's go for a meal, they might say to you, I'd love to go for a hot Indian. Well, I couldn't think of anything worse than a hot Indian. That sounds awful, doesn't it? I don't mean,
No.
I hate spicy food.
We're all stick to a mild one. You're far safer.
Yeah.
That's I'm with you on that one, Val.
I think I should have used the word meal there. Hot Indian meal, not a hot Indian. Yeah.
But do you think ask you a slightly controversial question here, the monoculture that's sort of predating the country with regards to agriculture and modern farming techniques, do you think that's another reason why we're getting such a big decline in insects and the associated wildlife?
I do. I think it made a terrific difference, particularly in the 70s, when farmers seemed to sort of suddenly gear up and start to use, the field started to get larger, the machinery started to get heavier, which compacted the soil. They're putting a lot of fertilizer on it, all sort of upset the balance. But actually, there are huge changes in farming because the farmers can't sustain it. One of the problems was, in the 70s, they started using land which wasn't really suitable for crops. They started to try to pump up the fertilizer because where I live in the Cotswolds, in the 70s, this land here was all grazed by sheep or other animals. And suddenly farmers started to drive towards growing crops ploughed and they brought up the stone and they put more fertilizer on it. Well, the truth is, they haven't been able to sustain it because the fertilizer is too expensive, and the yields, are poor, and they're getting poorer because of climate change. So we've got farmers around here who are really experimenting with sustainable farming and different methods, because I'm not far across the fields from Adam Henson, who's on Countryfile, and he's even colder than we are actually up there. But, so farming is changing because there are whole breeds that a lot of younger farmers are really going back to a different way of life. I've got a book on my bookshelf, which I can never remember the name of. And it's called English Pastoral, and it's by James Rebanks. And I recommend that 2 books for people to read if they are readers. One is Isabel Tree's book on the Knepp estate, which will make you feel so much better about wildlife. But this is called English Pastoral, and it's written by James Rebanks, who inherits a farm in the Lake District that his grandfather has had. And his grandfather has resisted modern pressures to borrow lots of money and to turn his farm into something other than a hill farm with sheep. And to cut a long story short, James Rebanks' land is rich in flora and wildlife than almost any other farm in his area. And when they analyse the soil, it's the best soil that these people have ever seen.
Gosh.
So, I do recommend that book. It's a really lovely read. I think agriculture is having to change because it's just not working anymore.
Especially, as you say, with global warming and climate change having that effect. Val, wildlife has obviously been an overriding feature in your gardens. But what's your sort of take on last year's Chelsea Flower Show, where wildflowers, and I use that term very loosely, as a lot of people were just pointing when I was there to say, what are those weeds having on their show gardens? What do you think that sort of message is sending out to the gardener of today?
Well, I was very disappointed. I had to go up and do a talk, and it was up in Derbyshire way, and my sat-nav wasn't behaving. And of course, being Val, I had factored in a couple of nursery visits on the way. So I found myself at Avondale Nursery in Coventry buying plants, and then I found myself at another nursery, and then I tried to get up towards Coles Hill and cut across, but my sat-nav kept sending me along the A45, and then I went up, and I went between Coventry and Birmingham, and I got stuck in traffic, which gave me loads of time to observe the gardens, the front gardens, many of which had cars in them. But the ones that didn't have cars had been just left as wild patches, and they were full of weeds. Now, there's nothing wrong with weeds. I mean, weeds are quite an important part of the wildlife and the natural cycle. When I was at Cook Norton, for instance, I always used to get aphids on the back of the shepherd's purse. And because I didn't know what I was doing when I first went there, I used to pull them up. And then I realized that they were a really important food source for birds and things like that. So I started leaving this as, weeds are only wildflowers. But I didn't get the impression anybody was gardening those patches. I still think gardening is actually about growing plants in a sympathetic way. I mean, we grow most of our own vegetables here. We grow fruit. We try to grow strawberries. We grow a lot of plants here. And, we have an allotment. We have dahlias on the allotment. Now, that to me is gardening. And I sometimes think it's difficult because the show gardens, I am ashamed to say, I don't look at very many of them, because I'm not a garden designer, I'm a plants person, and I'm seduced into the floral marquee. Indeed. There are certain designers like Charlotte Edwards and Hugo. Do I mean Charlotte Edwards? and Hugo Barg, is that the right name?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Hugo Barg.
Yeah, I always look at those because they use plants wonderfully well.
Yeah.
I mean, but I don't like a lot of the style element that goes into Chelsea Gardens, where they try to recreate Hidcote, or particularly, they did Cedric Morris this time.
They did, yes.
And it was nothing like Cedric Morris's garden, I can tell you that. Yeah. I did like the plants in it, but so I think there's a place for weeds on the outer edges, but I think to convince gardeners that gardening is just letting everything, go wild is not gardening.
No.
To me, anyway.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying there. Reading your book, Val, you do like to naturalise your bulbs in grass and your lawns. How easy is this to achieve? And I suspect you probably like the idea of No Mow May.
I probably like the idea of what? Sorry.
No Mow May.
I like the idea of no mow. Full stop.
Okay.
We have verges.
There we go. That's an even better one. When can you launch that for us, Val? That'd be brilliant.
Why is it good? Of No Mow May. I'm a member of Plant Life. I think it's ridiculous. I'm sorry. We have verges to our cottage, grass verges, and they're cut once a year in September. And they have been a terrific source. I don't know what to call it, really. We live in a village where the parish council spend most of their budget on mowing. Everything is mowed and clipped. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was a young teacher, I did a study on mini beasts in a school in Birmingham, and we went out there and it had trees, and the groundsman came every week and mowed and tidied it. And we went out there and we did this thing of shaking the trees and looking in the grass, and 3 days, and guess what? We found diddly squat. Mm. So I took them down to the local churchyard, which was not mown, and it was beautiful. It was May, and there were a lot of cow parsley was out. There were remnants of things like violets and primroses, and we're going back into the 1980s, and it was absolutely full of life. So I don't mow all my grass. We have areas of long grass here. We have 2 bulb lawns, and round the fruit trees, you can see the pictures in the book. There is that is left. It's been mown, but it will be left now. Snowdrops will come up, crocuses will come up, daffodils will come up. Fritillaria pyrenica will come up, yellow rattle will come up, followed by all sorts of other things. There'll be Camassias in there. And when people say that organic gardening doesn't work, and they, try to present these very pristine, clipped, immaculate gardens, you only have to look at the King's Highgrove Garden and the way he's done those meadows to know that is really the way forward. I would love people to leave some of their grass. I do mow and I do edge, and it does look neat because the grass looks as though it should be there, the longer grass, and people are drawn to it like a magnet in summer because they watch the bees on it. Things have come back like hop trefoil. It's very, very colourful. And, when we cut it, I don't cut it. The Best Beloved cuts it. We cut it by hand because we don't want to do strim any frogs or anything like that. I don't own a strimmer, for instance. I wouldn't have a strimmer, in my shed because they do so much damage to hedgehogs and things. So I would prefer people, to adopt the longer grass, and then the other bulb lawn is left long. And we've had a bee orchid come back there. All of its own volition. So, I'm not a great lover of everything being mown and striped lawns. I think it uses fossil fuel, and I actually find longer grass interesting. And when the National Trust stopped mowing all their lawns way back, probably about 20 years ago now, because of expense, it took a lot of man hours, and it cost a lot of money to actually get it done. So they decided they would cut one path through these areas of long grass, two things happened. The public loved it, absolutely loved it, and the butterfly numbers went right up. Matthew Oates was the butterfly man then, and I interviewed him. And the brown butterflies, the marbled whites and the ringlets and the gatekeepers and the meadow browns, they suddenly went right up in number. So I think I've said enough I've offended enough people on lawns, I think.
Well, I think everyone has their own choice to make, don't they, at the end of the day? And some people like going and mowing the lawn every Saturday.
As part of a routine, yes.
Yeah, I don't think it is about choice, though. I think it's about our planet surviving. If everybody takes that attitude and says, I want to have a closely mowed lawn and I want this and I don't want aphids and all this, our wildlife is going to go down and down and down. And that's all the things like the bees. I mean, bee numbers. When I started reading about bumblebees, for instance, I got a book which was written by a couple of guys, and I'm on my feet again because I'm looking for it on my shelf, and it's called I can't find it. Anyway, it's by a chap called Free and someone else. It was written in the 1950s. Now they didn't even bother to record the numbers of a lot of bees because they're prolific.
Right.
Harder bee. He writes about it as being everywhere. And now it's so rare. You find it near Newport. You find it in certain parts of the country. And it's called the shrill carder bee because it makes a shrill noise. But I'm deaf, so I can't hear anything like that. We have got to change the way that we behave, all of us, in the world and in our gardens. It isn't saying, I like a neatly mowed lawn. It's actually saying, we have to look after all these wild creatures because we don't own this world. We're part of this world. And I've got grandchildren. And when I was 16, I moved up to Leamington Spa. And I was a cadet nurse. And I used to go out on my bike. And I was bowled over by the wildflowers and the bees and all the wildlife. I got told off when I was learning to drive because I was looking at the birds rather than the road. Well, my grandchildren will never know that abundance. No. And what will be left for their grandchildren? So let's be precise about this. It's not about whether you like a nice, neat lawn. It's whether you should perhaps leave some of that lawn for a few of God's creatures.
I totally agree. Sorry, what I was going to say earlier, Val, was that ultimately if you like a nice, neat patch of lawn, make sure it's a patch rather than the entirety, because you can combine sort of getting some wild flowers, getting some nice bulbs and what have you growing around the edge, and having a strip in the middle where you can put your deck chair and enjoy a nice bit of grass to walk on. Although, personally, I've walked on long grass and short grass, and I don't think there's much difference. I think it's just a wonderful sensation getting outside and enjoying the sunshine and the wildlife, isn't it?
Yes.
Val, as we sort of come towards the end of the podcast, can I just ask you a few more questions? We've got your travel. You've travelled around, obviously, in your life. You've come across many inspiring gardens over the years. Do you have any favourites you'd like to share with us?
Oh, that's so hard. I find this really difficult because I often like gardens that other people don't like. I don't know. I can't actually pluck a garden. I think the trouble is, I spend so much time in my own garden because it takes a long time to garden, and I'm writing for a lot of the time, so I don't get out. And a lot of gardens, I'm very disappointed in. So it's really hard for me to choose a garden that I really, really love. I'm sure there are gardens I really love, but I can't actually think of them.
No, that's fine. No, obviously you're very busy with your garden and your gardening columns. Have you any sort of plans for another book in the near future?
Yeah, I'm just started another book actually.
Okay.
I'm about a fifth of the way through it.
Okay.
It's quite a short book, and it's about resilient plants because everybody's wrestling with climate change, and a lot of books regarding climate change, it's all been about plants for dry and drought, but we don't get we do get droughts, but we also get deluges. It's hardly stopped raining here.
Yep.
For weeks and weeks, we've had the odd dry day.
Yep.
And that's seeing off a lot of my plants. You know, they're not doing so well. So I'm doing this book on plants that will survive drought and wet conditions.
Excellent.
Because there are certain plants, you look at a genus like border phloxes, for instance, and there are one or two of them that really stand out as being resilient. Monica Linden Bell, for instance, pale pink one found in a chalk garden. So I'm doing this book, which is very planty, which is really nice to do. And I think it's probably going to be out in 2005. I haven't done another book since the Living Jigsaw because it was such a big project.
Yeah. We'll look forward to. I'll say we look forward to reading that, Val, in 2025 then, or thereabouts.
Yeah,
hopefully. Yeah, that would be good because tough plants are. Yeah, like you've identified, Val, what we all need because so many times you get a dry patch and then it's just
looking out of the window today. I mean,
puddles.
Yeah. It puts you in a quandary because water is a precious resource, and I will not water my flower borders when the reservoirs are low. You know, my plants just have to tough it out because I don't think it's ethically right when the reservoirs are very low and to use it on the garden. Really, I mean, I use the water butt water when I can, and if it's wet, I fill up lots of watering cans, and try to be as sustainable as possible. Yeah, because I think gardening has to be sustainable. We're living in a very different era to the one that I grew up in. Yeah. When I used to find wildflowers, in lots of parts of London. They've all gone.
Yeah, different times and not for the good,
unfortunately. It's a different time, yes.
Yeah. Val, we do ask this question, or these next couple of questions to all our guests. So you've been shipwrecked on a desert island. Which plant or tool would you relish on your castaway island?
Oh my God, castaway island. Well, I don't think it would do very well on a castaway island. And it's very, very difficult because I love so many plants. I really do. So to actually choose one, what would I choose? I don't know. I'd probably choose, it's so difficult. I know which tool I'd choose.
Okay.
And it's a guilty tool. Because years and years and years ago, when I first started writing, a chap sent me what was called a cobra-headed weeder. And it had like a snake's head with a sort of diamond thing on the end, and it was hooked. And it's fantastic for weeding. So when you're, see a dandelion, you get your cobra tool and you hook it out. And the reason I feel guilty about it was I said that I would promote it, and he sent it to me in the post, and I lost his details, and I've never promoted it because I couldn't promote it because I couldn't remember who he was. Yeah. So every time I get this cobra-headed tool out, which I've had probably nearly 30 years, I think, for this poor chap sending it to me. So that is such a useful thing, and I get such pleasure. I spend a lot of time down on my knees, sort of hand weeding and tiffling and things, because I have so many plants, probably 200 different snowdrops to start with, and loads of other plants. So it's quite meticulous, the weeding in the summer. You can't sort of run over a lot of it with a hoe or anything. So I think that would be my tool of choice. Now, what would be my plant of choice? Well, that is so difficult, really difficult. I absolutely love Amazonias.
Okay,
right.
Those eastern blue star plants that flower in May, and they have little clusters of slate blue flowers. They take a long, long time, but I love them because they come through the soil, and I like the sort of bigger ones. Tabernae montana is one I particularly like, and the shoots come through the ground, and they're like very, very dark asparagus spears, and they're one of these plants that come up really quickly. They, 1 minute they're coming through the ground, and the next minute they're 2 or 3 feet high. They sort of move, and then they get these clusters of slate blue flowers, which I find a really lovely colour in spring, May time, with totally tangerine Aegeum. And then it produces long seed pods.
Okay.
The stems stay dark, and then you get the dark seed pods, and then in autumn you get this wonderful butter yellow colour on them. So I think I probably tried to take that one.
Yeah.
Wow. I've never even heard of that. That's brilliant. I'm going to have to look that one up. That's a great suggestion. Thank you for that. And obviously through your life in gardening, have you picked up any amusing stories or have you got any funny tales for us that we can share with our listeners about something that's happened?
Oh, I might have to think about that for a second.
Fine.
Let me see. I'm very, very, very. I love Anne-Marie Powell, and we went on a trip to the Loire Valley, and she was quite surprised that I'm a bit of a Dumbo when it comes to losing things and doing things. I'm not the most organised person, but anyway, we were on this bus and it was hot weather and we'd had a really long day, and we were on the bus and had been put up in rather basic Holiday Inn style hotels, but this particular night we were going to stay in a French chateau with a man who grew loads of tomatoes and dahlias, and he had a company called, I think, Le Jardinière. I think that's correct. So we're on the bus, and Anne-Marie is going on about how she was so looking forward to this bath. And I am one of those people who jumps under a shower for 2 minutes because can't sit still long enough for a bath. But I really got quite enthusiastic about this lovely bath. And we had a brochure with all the rooms and everything there. Well, when we got there, it was about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, and the chap had set out all these tomatoes, and he was making green cocktails and healthy drinks. And we got there, and we were dying of thirst, and we were really grubby. And this went on, and he started passing these green cocktails around, no alcohol, just plants and tomatoes. Which didn't go down well with Anne-Marie at all, but I'm teetotal, so I wasn't so bothered. And this went on for a long time. And while he was talking about healthy living, his wife was in the background drinking red wine, and that really annoyed Anne-Marie. By that time, getting a bit desperate. So at the end of this spiel, it got to 8 o'clock, and we thought, well, how on earth are we ever going to get ready for this lavish dinner we're meant to be having? Well, at the end of it, he said, oh, by the way, I've got a public announcement to make. And we thought, crikey, what's this? And he said, the boiler's broken, there's no hot water, and you can find an electric kettle over there.
Oh, no. Oh, illusion shattered.
I have never seen anybody's face crumple as far as Anne-Marie did.
Oh, no.
So off we went with our kettles. We still got a good meal at the end of it.
Good stuff.
But it was quite funny. I think that was one of my golden moments.
Brilliant.
Great story, Val. Finally, your books, including the Living Jigsaw, is still available. I managed to track down a copy on Amazon, and World of Books have got it as well. But how do our Dig It listeners keep up with your current musings?
Well, you can read me on Hartley Botanic. I've got a blog, and I just won Digital Writer of the Year with it. Lovely. Which was good. Mm-hmm. I only put it in because I couldn't get the PDFs for some practical stuff I've done in Garden Answers. And actually, Greg Loades was the editor, and I beat him in the competition. Yes, and if he'd sent me the PDFs in time, I never would have gone in for the digital. So,
well done.
Anyway, you can read me on there. You can read me in Amateur Gardening.
Indeed.
You can read me quite often in the Telegraph, not as often because they're not that planty anymore. I've got some things coming up in the English garden on snowdrops and hellebores. Brilliant. I pop up all over the place. Yeah. I just try to keep busy. Yeah. I don't earn a great living, but it's interesting.
And you have a website, Val, people could go to?
Yeah, I've got a website, but I don't post anything on it apart from my talks, my books, and pictures of the garden.
Perfect. Val, it's a really good book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and the photography is something else. But we really thank you for your time on Dig It today. I hope you've enjoyed it. We've certainly enjoyed chatting with you.
I hope I haven't talked too much.
Not at all. It's the idea of our chats, isn't it? It'd be a bit one-sided if it wasn't.
You can understand why my grandmother used to take me in the garden, can't you?
That's lovely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Val. It's been wonderful.
No, thank you.
Thank you for asking me. Bye.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.